Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live stream for the National Association for Primary Education. It's also being streamed to Rhythmically Speaking. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Mark Taylor. I'm the Vice Chair of NAPE and also the creator and host of Education on Fire. And NAPE have been a long-term sponsor and supporter of the show. So this is kind of our first proper collaboration. The details of this podcast and everything related to it are NAPE and Oxford School of Thought focused, so that's why we're going to be doing it in this same way, but we're just so that people know we're streaming to both the NAPE YouTube channel and also Rhythmically Speaking as well. If you have a comment, if you'd like to be involved in the show, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the comments. We can bring that up and we can ask as we go along, although we've got a lot to cover today. Just to make sure that you know that we're here for about an hour, so our aim is to kind of cover what we're doing, but also to make sure that we give you an opportunity to be involved, hence the reason of being live rather than just doing a recorded video or a recorded podcast. So what are we going to be doing? This is the main thing that we're going to be here for, and it's related, as you know, to primary inspection. But here are the three main areas we're going to try and cover. What are the problems with it historically and I guess currently now? What changes are required based on what we think those problems are? And what can we learn from other people, different parts of the world, different areas that we can actually implement and bring into our awareness and have a discussion about that as we come through. So those are the three areas that we're going to be mainly focusing on, but we're going to broaden that out with some subcategories and different things that we're going to be looking at as well. So a couple of websites I'd like just to show, just so that you know where to go and what to do before we get going. This is the website for the National Association for Primary Education. You can go there for nape.org.uk, and in there you can see there's lots of everything that's going on related to NAPE, lots of links to lots of resources. So do go and check that out as well. And the main reason for actually having this podcast was related to the Oxford School of Thought and the fact that they are the organisation that have created the document that's kind of given us what it is that we are going to be talking about today. And if you go to their website, you have the ability to click through and actually look at their reports. As you can see there, it goes to their paper and you can download the report straight from their website. So do go and check that out after this conversation so that you can really see and understand exactly what's going on and where a lot of what it is that we're going to be talking about coming through. So I really do appreciate that. So if everybody is ready, let's bring them all on so that we can say hello. And first of all, I would actually like to say hello to someone who's already watching. Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us. Mike is the chair of NAPE, so great to see you here. Thank you so much indeed, Mike, for being here. So we have Peter, we have Pip, we have Lynn, and we have Alfie, and I'm going to give each of them the opportunity to introduce themselves properly, give a bit of background of how they're related to NAPE and OST, and a little bit about their professional background. So if you don't know who they are, sort of how they sort of fit into our current educational world and how they're all working together. So, Peter, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'm Peter Cansell. I was the founder of Oxford School of Thought, and I'm the information officer for NAPE. So, dual role. Very interesting to work with all the other people here. And it's interesting in that we all have a NAPE-related background. We all have school-related backgrounds. I was a head teacher before I retired, and in the primary school. And I would just briefly say that the Oxford School of Thought is about primary education. It's not about secondary education, particularly, as is NAPE about the National Association for Primary Education. So this is where we focus our ideas.
Perfect. Pip.
Yes, good evening. My name's Pip Marples. I'm a retired head teacher, Oxford School of Thought trustee and NAPE counsellor. I go into school once a week and to support class teachers with whole class teaching.
Amazing. And just before I bring Lynn on, I must say I haven't seen Lynn for a little while, and Lynn was director of the school that I did some music education with, so it's brilliant to be able to see her and have a conversation, and I appreciate all the support that she's given me over the years, both from a musical standpoint within the school but also getting me involved in NAPE as well. So Lynn, thanks so much for being here, and yes, give us your introduction.
Hello everybody. Hi Mark, it's nice to see you too. I'm Lynn Hannay and I was chair of NAPE for 5 years, but also I worked on council for many years before that. I was a head teacher for 17 years and worked in schools before that for about 20 years. Since stopping being a head teacher, I've worked as a consultant doing various things, including residential arts courses for children. And now I've pared that back to doing a couple of days a week, working with mostly with teenagers who need additional support, having spent the rest of my career in primary. But I'm really enjoying the teenagers at the moment. I got involved in the Oxford School of Thought through Pip, who's incredibly persuasive, and he persuaded me to join them, oh, I don't know, about a year ago now, I guess. And I worked a lot on the alternative inspection that we've been looking at and putting together, which I've thoroughly enjoyed and I think is really been really worthwhile. That's
Fantastic. Me. Thank you so much indeed. And Alfie?
Yeah, I'm still here. Alfie Hay. I was a head teacher for 27 years, village school right through to an urban school. And then for my sins, I joined an advisory service in Reading and even trained as an inspector, just so I could find out what it was all about. And since I retired, well, Pip keeps asking me to do things, and I try to avoid it, but unfortunately, here I am.
See, I'm getting a reputation.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely a theme coming through, Pip. So we'll see how that continues over the course of the next hour or so. Yeah. So who would like to explain why the report was written? Who was sort of the leader of that? Did that come from you, Peter, or was it Pip again sort of pulling your arm to kind of get it going?
It's ancient to speak. Pete. Yeah, well, the thought occurred to us that as head teachers, we really had just been accepting of the way that Ofsted worked. And as primary head teachers, we'd never really thought about the way inspections take place. And you will remember that there was a big hoo-ha a couple of years ago, and people started questioning what Ofsted were doing. We felt very much that what wasn't being questioned was the way in which they were doing it, in terms of the distinction between primary and secondary, because we suddenly realized it was almost as though the veils dropped from our eyes that we were being inspected as mini secondary schools, that we were, maybe a preparatory stage for being a secondary school, that we were inspected through a subject-based curriculum, through subject-based approach, whereas in most primary schools, that's not really the way that education is happening. Maybe maths and English are taught separately, but very often the rest of the curriculum can be quite mixed and cross-curricular, and there's integration that isn't recognised. And what's even less recognised is the pastoral element that happens within primary schools. And so with this sudden realisation, we felt that that was really where we should be looking, and evolved a way of looking at it. And then with lots of discussion with a lot of people, actually, and input from all the people here, but also others outside of this group, we started to create a document which we felt should be supportive of Ofsted rather than a negative thing, which is what everybody else seems to be doing. Everybody says we should get rid of Ofsted. We felt that we're not going to achieve that, so why not give them something supportive?
And the other thing about it, Mark, is that Ofsted is there, but actually it's not serving primary schools well, because primary schools are all about children growing, individual children growing, and it's very much an individual. And primary schools look at individual children and help them to grow. They're not being schooled, they're being educated and learning. And so we felt that Ofsted needed to help us and help schools to actually assist that process rather than clamp down the way they have been in their measurements.
It does seem to me that
And that
it's a
sort
really
of
important distinction, isn't it? That in terms of knowing what you're trying to do, and I really appreciate that sort of explanation, Peter, in terms of having a positive attitude to what we're trying to do, and actually accepting the fact that maybe Ofsted isn't going to go anywhere. But like you say, being part of that conversation, which the government have asked for as well, in terms of how it can be changed or how it can be influenced or how we can get these opinions across. Sorry, Pip, you were going to carry on from that conversation.
Well, just following up on Alfie's point about children, the implications that Ofsted had on our young children being tested in inappropriate ways, having begun their formal education far too early. That's one element. Another is that government interventions right into the classroom through their own policies and with Ofsted have dictated to teachers what they teach and constrain creativity in favor of a kind of uniform delivery. I hate that word, but that's what it is. And then a third element, that head teachers have just been summarily removed from their schools on the basis of these inspections. And so, you know, my general comment about all this is how cruel our education system is and how unnecessarily punitive the system is. And I think that has to be said very strongly. I think it has to be said to governors, and I think it needs to be said to parents.
So what is the implication then of this sort of fear-driven inspection? I think a lot of people know that. I know certainly from my work in schools, as soon as they know Ofsted is on the horizon, let alone when it's been announced, is the whole school becomes a different school, and everyone is literally, incredibly fearful, which I guess isn't the way it used to be. I remember Lynn having a conversation on the NAPE podcast many years ago now about how inspectors were there to support and help you grow and help you learn and develop those things. So why do you think that change has happened? Maybe Lynn, you'd be the person to sort of take us into
Well, I think, you know, the conversation you and I had, Mark, and I've said this to many people, is when I was a young teacher, inspectors weren't feared. They came in and they were supportive. Thinking of the main inspector that I worked with when I was a very young teacher was Bill Lahr, who I know he's still around somewhere. And he would come into the classroom and he'd go, "Oh, that's interesting. I'll come back next week and we'll do a bit more of that." And he'd sit in the corner and watch what you're doing. And it took you a while to realize he'd thought what you were doing was pretty awful. But he didn't walk away from it. He came back and he helped and supported. And he'd say, "I know a course that you could go on that I think would be really helpful to you. Or I'll bring a course into the schools." So it's much more a sort of advisory stroke holistic approach stroke collaborative approach. Very, very different feel. So certainly through my career, when Ofsted first came into schools with their strict criteria and their much more, as Pippa said, punitive approach, it was a little bit of a shock, quite a lot of a shock to most of us. And I think that came along with, first of all, the introduction of the national curriculum, which I don't think any of us would argue with the fact that there should be some national agreement as to what children learn at some point, although there needs to be more flexibility. But alongside that, then we got literacy hours and numeracy hours, and then came amounts of time you could spend on certain subjects, and it all became very constricted and very top down. And then came SATs, and at that point, then those were the things we were being judged on. I can remember an inspector coming in and saying, "You've spent too long teaching this subject." Well, it doesn't work in a primary setting. You don't teach history for half an hour and stop and do it again the following week, the children have forgotten what they're doing and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have that supportive element, nor does it keep the creativity and the excitement going and the motivation. So I think, these are the things that have gone wrong. And I think, to go back to something Pip said earlier, I think one of the ways we take the fear out of it, particularly in primary schools, is for inspectors to start recognizing that the role of the primary teacher is very different to the role of the secondary teacher. We're with those children 24/7. We have a relationship beyond a couple of hours a week teaching a subject. So it's a very, very different animal. And I think that isn't recognized. And, inspectors go into primary classrooms to watch a lesson. What they're not seeing is that whole picture of that fundamental relationship with the teacher and 30 children of very differing abilities. I think I've lost the question, but there you go. Somebody else take over for a while.
I was just thinking one of the talents that my experience of primary teaching is that the teachers say to children, show me what you can do. And some children do it a different way. And the teacher's skill is to guide them to the right direction, but allowing them to grow. And I thought that the teachers I saw latterly as an advisor were having to work out what was expected of them by external forces. And so their own creativity, their own thinking, they became more like automatons. I don't mean that because obviously teachers aren't, but they had to think to meet other people's criteria. And the creative nature of teaching in primary school is to take a child and let them learn and watch them sparkle.
So
That's not the way Ofsted want it,
so
to my mind.
yeah, could I just follow into that then? So as someone who then trained as an inspector, did you then feel that sometimes teachers and schools miss the point that they don't have to do that, or actually because of the way the inspection is set up that they have to do that in order to fill the criteria?
I did feel the teachers, in fact, one of my colleagues said, you're not doing it the right way. Those teachers won't be helped by you because you're trying to work alongside them instead of showing them how to meet the criteria. And I was really upset by that. I hate the whole idea of children being schooled into a shape. I want them to grow. Oh, stop! I'm not going to do that. But you know what I mean. I want the children to grow, and I want the teachers to grow as well.
Well, you do, Alfie, but is that a good thing from a administrative point of view? From a DFE point of view, is it a good thing to have contrary people like us in schools, which we taught alongside? Most of the teachers that I taught alongside were that bit rebellious, and the people that I trained with, they wanted to speak their own mind. Is that easy to manage? If you're running a government, if you're running education in this country, isn't it easier if you can have everybody that toes the line, that does what they're told?
I will come back to that one. I do think that teachers should meet targets. And I think they should be left to meet those targets the way it's appropriate for the children they're dealing with. And it's not a standardized target, it's a growth target. And I think that's where I differ from these SAT standards, because children grow in different speeds. In one class in 1 year, you know full well that 30 children will grow at different speeds, and they won't achieve the same standard at the end. But over the years of their schooling, they will grow, and they will grow if they dealt with appropriately for their own personalities. And schools have to be different as well. And I know that the politicians say primary schools are very successful now. We've got the best phonics in the whole of the universe, and maths were rising up, but the measurements are so minimal that they're not looking at the creative growth of children. Are we going off the point here? But I think Ofsted should be looking at how teachers help children to grow.
Mhm. Well, I'd like to pick up what you're saying about speed, because in some of the inspections that I suffered, teachers were picked up on the pace of their lesson. And that was an Ofsted word, the pace. You had to get that right and keep things moving. And there wasn't a feeling of children and teachers being able to be reflective and take their time over things and mull things over. And if you remember the literacy hour, where, what was it? The hour was split up into 4 parts, and you had to achieve this, that, and the other, and have it was a plenary at the end, you know? The whole thing became very artificial.
But it was at that point when there began to be interference in how we did things, not just what we were doing. So, you know, I can live with a guideline as to what content might be, provided there's flexibility to do more or less or adapt. But I think a strict guideline, as you were saying, Alfie, that expects every child to have achieved this by this point in the year or the end of the year, it's untenable for kids, and therefore it's untenable for children. And I think, you know, I think we're all agreeing here. There has to be the ability for teachers to work in the ways that are appropriate for the children in front of them, and that varies from group of children to group of children, to child to year to year.
The other aspect of primary, which I don't think is recognised enough by Ofsted model, is the way you gradually share responsibility from the family, but you go along with the family. And it's very unusual at secondary level that the family is probably less important than the peer relationships. But the family at primary, and where they come from, and how the family can support the child, and how the family can support the school, and vice versa, is not, to my mind, taken in consideration by Ofsted, which is why we wanted to have this primary faced inspection.
It doesn't recognise either, Alfie, the way in which schools integrate within the community. I mean, one of the things that has been noticeable over the past decades has been the demise of other aspects of small communities, certainly village communities. You know, with the demise of the church, the demise of the local pubs, and the schools have become a local hub for the community. And primary schools work very hard to make sure that they are integrated and they are supporting the families within their community. And, you know, I think that became evident during the pandemic, didn't it? You know, that the way in which schools are interacting with people and helping to keep the community running, it became the focal point. Schools became the focal point, certainly, of their communities. And I think that's not recognised at all, that work that happens in schools.
And I think one of the things that many schools now report post-pandemic is the number of children who haven't arrived at school having developed in the way that perhaps they would have done. So more speech issues, more behavioural issues like still being in nappies, not toileting, you know, not focusing in the way. And schools need a free hand to be able to support parents and children through those milestones to get those children back on track and to get them I guess, to get them able to function in school and at home in a way that we would have expected before. And to me, that shows the amount of work that schools and particularly early years do in child development. And we have that sort of got pushed to one side, that the Ofsted system doesn't recognise developmental milestones in children. They just expect them to fit into these boxes, do this at this point, do this at this point, without understanding that it's, as Alfie says, it's a process, and a process that each child will go on their own, but with appropriate support. And that's the skills that we bring as early years, and particularly what we would have called infants. Key stage 1 teachers have got these amazing skills in knowing what to do next to support the child to move on. And those things are not recognised, I don't think.
Well, they weren't recognised by us, Lynn. When we started writing the paper, I have to say quite shamefacedly that we didn't recognise the importance of early years. We knew about it, we just didn't include it within this paper. And there's a feeling amongst some people, I think amongst some of the unions, that early years should perhaps be separated off and inspected separately. We felt very much that early years is a critical part of primary education, but when you look at how much children learn in those early years, the massive gains of learning in those very first years of children's lives, it's such an important period. And and when you get an inspector who comes and looks at a lesson where children are playing in the sandpit, and the teacher knows that they're doing all sorts of mathematical things, but all the inspector sees is children playing in the sandpit and shoveling sand and pushing it about, and leaves after about 10 minutes and doesn't come back and see the conclusion, which is what's happened in that lesson and what the teacher has noted. The record.
Pete, can I just cut in there, because we did recognise early years. We did. On our initial discussion group in Oxford, we had an early years, very experienced early years teacher. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do remember, Pip. Yeah, but we brought in that specialist because we recognised that it was our failure in the beginning when we first started talking about it, not when we first started writing this paper, but when we wrote the original proposal. We overlooked early years, and we put that right in this paper. That was my point, really.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So could I think this is really interesting in terms of what the changes might be. I mean, you're sort of talking about cross-curricular links and teacher-pupil relationships and communities, all of which are incredibly important. But do you think any of that is possible if teachers themselves aren't given the professional understanding and the ability to let them teach in a way that they know that's best? And I take Lynn's point that if you've got overall areas that you're being inspected in, and the idea of sort of being able to explain and understand what you're trying to achieve under some kind of guideline, but you're then given the freedom to be able to do that, like you say, with different ages of pupils, the different skill sets of pupils, different ways that you want to learn. But if within the inspection framework itself, if you're not allowed to do that as a professional without literally sort of dotting every I and crossing every T, do you actually think that's even remotely possible, I guess is my question.
I mean, we don't want to go down the road of professionalism in a way. I mean, it's one of my favorite subjects, and we could have a podcast all about that. The fact is that for teachers, the child is our first priority. And that should go without saying, really. But that view has got subsumed by Ofsted, and it almost seems as though teachers and head teachers become the target and the priority for Ofsted to make sure that head teachers and teachers are doing the right thing, and the needs of the child get left unthought about, really.
Can I come in there, Pip? Because I know I've told you this story, but I think it exemplifies Ofsted inspectors are human beings as well. And they are having to deal with a regime that demands certain measurements. And I was governor of a local school, and this school I knew we did all the stuff about individual learning targets. We'd had all this special needs assessments. It was so perfectly done. The head teacher was very efficient, and he'd got all the paperwork ready, and I was sure that we were safe. And the school came out as outstanding. And I asked the inspector why the school was outstanding. I knew it was very good. I knew it was run well. I knew the children were happy here. I knew they learned, there was a buzz in the place. And she said, well, there was a moment when I was watching a lesson. They were teaching the subject of the Romans. And at the end of that lesson, I watched those children, and they believed they were Romans.
You mean they spoke Latin?
Non sequitur, non sequitur. And the point she was making was she recognized this was a learning establishment, and she was overriding any negatives because she saw it all worked. And I think Ofsted inspectors themselves are sort of hogtied by the need to impress the bosses.
Well, I would agree totally, Alfie. My experience with one of the inspectors that came to my school was the conversation that we had where he came and said, look, I'm a bit of a problem here because my observations of this school is that it's a place where I'd really love my children to come. But I've got a difficulty because I'm looking at putting you into special measures because you're not ticking all the boxes that you need to tick. But what the children are getting is exactly what children are getting. In the end, we didn't go into special measures quite, but it's exactly what you're saying. They are hogtied. They have a set of requirements of what they have to do, and schools have to fit those requirements. Well, that's the wrong way of going about it, isn't it? I mean, it's
Pete. So should we be also looking at the role of the inspector and why people become inspectors and why they're willing to fit in to its tight constraints against their better professional judgments? And this is where I begin to get upset about the whole system, because I think people make the mistake of becoming inspectors and they allow, again, using that word, to be subsumed by a system. And it's a wretched place to be, in my view.
But Pip, isn't this why we decided to do our paper in the way we did it? Because the conversation we had at one point was we were all angry at the start. Ruth Perry had recently died. We were whipped up into that anger, and quite rightly so. However, we also recognized that just being angry was going to get us nowhere, and that there were inspectors who also wanted change, and that therefore we approached this paper in the way of saying, okay, let's look at what an alternative might be that we can offer to the inspection system, to Ofsted, to the DFE, to whoever's listening, and say there is another way. There is another way for us as educators, for inspectors. We know that there are people out there who just think Ofsted should be abolished, but we recognise the fact that that simply is not going to happen. and certainly not anytime soon. And so one of our thrusts was to say, so what can we do to make life better for everybody at the moment?
Yeah.
And our focus, being primary school people, was to look at how we could stop. Because I honestly believe, someone asked me yesterday, and I believe quite strongly, even more so now, that a lot of what goes wrong in primary school inspections is because we are inspecting against a secondary school regime. And we're not recognizing all the things we're talking about. And whilst ever we are doing that, things will continue to go wrong in primary school inspections, unless there is a recognition that these are a different animal to a secondary school. Not worse, not better, just different. The children are at a different developmental stage, and the teachers function in a different way, or would do if they were allowed to. And to go back to what Mark was saying, I do think there are teachers who come out of college now excited and enthusiastic, and they get into schools and realize that the schools are just trying their hardest to keep their heads above water. Many schools, not all, because they've got Ofsted coming soon, and the stuffing's knocked out of them, and they suddenly, all the creative things they want to do have gone because they have to do it in this way to fulfill these criteria.
So, with Mark's permission, can we then, because we've kind of done a deconstruct of Ofsted and taking up your point about being positive, I think we ought to ask Peter just to talk about the title of the paper and lead us into, why what we're saying is a strong proposal for progress.
I'm happy to do so, Pip, and it delights me that you draw me in that way. Nobody else will know the discussions we've previously had about my suggestion for a title and the resistance that there was felt by everybody else in the group. However, I will just explain where the title came from. I've long held the belief that there should be a campaign where every school, every primary school, every school actually puts a banner outside their school saying, "We require improvement," which is the idea of that is to suggest that every school does require improvement, because I think all of us would say, and all schools would say they do. But it actually takes the wind out of the sails of Ofsted. That was my point originally. And so that's where requires improvement came from. But there's actually a bigger point there, because the way in which we go about inspecting schools, is contrary to the way in which most other industries, businesses, organizations go about their accountability systems. Most organizations, I would say, if they want somebody to look at their business and say whether it's any good or not, would invite inspectors of some kind, auditors, maybe inspectors, some sort of body to come and look at them. They would invite them in. There would not be a fear factor there, because they would be setting up what the agenda is. In schools, we have for many years been writing SEFs, school evaluation forms, doing that school evaluation and able to identify what the improvements could be within the school. And if we look at what Lynn was saying earlier about what were HMI coming to school, Bill Lar was an HMI, in fact, wasn't he? Yeah. If we look at what they used to do, they would be supportive. But if you had a regime where you were inviting the inspectors in, where you were saying, "Come and look at our school, look at the good things we're doing. This is a problem we've got that we'd like some help with," that's a totally different outlook on what's happening in the school and the way you approach it. That would, to me, seem a way of overcoming the fears that heads have, that schools have, of the imposing Ofsted visit. because
We've
you
used the
control
word
it.
collaboration, Pete.
Yeah, and supportive. Yeah.
And we've described how teachers in primary school collaborate with the pupils to extend learning. And we're talking about a collaborative model where people can assess what you're doing and say, hey, that's great. How about this? That's not working so well. Let's work alongside you. This collaborative model is probably more expensive. Probably Ofsted couldn't afford it. But people like Pip decries Ofsted inspectors joining Ofsted. Well, people join Ofsted to think they want to try and help schools. They've done the bit in school. Now they want to try and help schools. This is a collaborative approach we're suggesting. And that's the whole basis of a call for change.
And there's a paper to be written there, I think, Alfie. Pip's already told me to write it.
Okay.
So taking that on board then, because we can, as is often the case, you can talk about these things over and over and over, but it doesn't change the fact that tomorrow morning there'll be a group of inspectors going into a school and it may look the way that we would rather it didn't. Is there anything happening that we know of where the actual system is different place, different area of the country, that we can take some heart from to say that we can actually show you this is what happens in this particular place, why it works, how it works, and more specifically, why that's going to be beneficial for the primary education system?
There certainly are. I mean, we use examples from Wales, Estyn in Wales. We understand that the revision of what's happened there has been much more successful. A really interesting approach has been taken by the Isle of Man, which is a much more supportive, collaborative approach, where because they run their own education system in the Isle of Man, where their inspectorate are much more locally based, I understand, and they have a group of schools that they are connected with. And we also looked at the church inspections that happen. Pip can probably explain a bit better than me.
It was SIAMS, wasn't it, Pete, which stood for Statutory Inspection of Anglican and Methodist Schools. And it's very much, they describe it as, I'm reading here, inspection is very much the coming together of professionals to enable fair and accurate judgments to be made for the benefit of the school. And of course, this is, a sort of Christian ethic-based inspection system, which sounds very humane. So we have those three examples, and they are working. But SIAMS, I would guess, goes alongside Ofsted as well, doesn't it? It isn't SIAMS or Ofsted, it's the two for church schools.
They get inspected by both, yes. Yeah. We also talked a bit about the Finnish system, didn't we?
Yes.
Go on.
Well, no, I mean the fact that they don't really have one.
Yeah.
And have a remarkably successful education system. But we've yet to research that a bit further, I reckon. But the time really has come for politicians to listen and take heed of research and teacher expertise and experience. Really for too long we've been bullied by ignorant government. And we really need to know from schools what's good for them and for the unions to stand up. And they've done wonderful surveys of how their members are feeling. They've had a good pushback at Ofsted, but they haven't, as far as I know, yet provided a viable proposal like we have with the Oxford School of Thought to suggest there is another way.
I talked yesterday to Jim Knight, a former education minister, member of the House of Lords, and who was very supportive. And he was saying that in his paper from 2 years ago, I think it was,
Beyond Ofsted.
Beyond Ofsted, that's right. That was one of the recommendations that they put in that paper, was that there should be a more disparate approach. There should be separated approaches to reflect the sort of schooling that was happening. And that's gone not any further, although Alice Bradbury from UCL, who did a lot of the research on that, has recently had papers published about her research on the way in which teachers feel about the inspection of their schools. And she was very supportive too, felt that this would, that a primary only approach would be welcomed in schools. And that was one of the features that they put towards their respondents, I think, and that they welcomed that. So there are moves, there's small moves. And talking of politicians, we actually have the support of Annalise Dodds, Annalise Dodds, who until recently, and because of her principles, resigned from a post within the Department of Education. In fact, it was in that ministry, her responsibility for women and families, I think. But she's been very supportive, and she's actually recommending this to the DFE. So it will be interesting to see if the tractions from those two quarters will actually make a difference as well. So there are small steps, but we're a very small organisation. NAPE is much bigger than OST, and yet I think that those of us in NAPE would say trying to get traction, trying to get people to listen to us is very difficult. And it takes me back to the beginning of OST, because the reason that I suddenly thought we need to have an education think tank that talks about primary education was because everybody, all of the media, all of the politicians, everybody that you spoke to, when they talked about schools, what they really meant was secondary schools. They don't mean primary schools. And we need to change that conversation, as well as changing a lot of the other culture that we have around primary schools and schools in general education.
Yeah, Pete, there was a very good example of that on my favourite podcast with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. And they were talking about the Conservative governments that have of the recent past, and how successful ministers were people who stayed there a long time, and all the changes that happened, in various different areas, from education, defence, exchequer, etc. All those changes made for bad policy and lack of continuity and so on. So what Rory Stewart said, but one minister who has been there for many years, Nick Gibb, is a really good example of a minister staying in power, as it were, and producing a good end result. And that was the first time I mean, it's a politician's perception, I really ought to respond to him, and I haven't. But it astonished me. But it's all about secondary schools. That was all about secondary schools.
Yeah. But it's very interesting that Nick Gibb was the choice of Michael Gove. In fact, I think a former flatmate of Michael Gove. When Michael Gove came into post as the Secretary of State for Education, one of the first things that he did was get rid of most of the senior officials. Most of them were lost within his first year. The people that replaced them were people who were prepared to go along with what they were being told by the Secretary of State. And some of them had no background in education at all. Some of them were from other spheres. And many of those people, many of those officials are still in post because it's a permanent civil service. And this is, it's quite significant. And you see similar things happening in America now. You know, that great changes of the administration in order to do what one person wants them to do, and I think that there are grave dangers there. And you know, I think I would be hard pressed to find any individual teacher who would say that the long time that Nick Gibb spent in post produced any valuable positive effect.
Especially in primary education.
Yeah.
Would any secondary school teachers say he did?
Well, I haven't met one then.
Okay.
And I've met plenty who said he's a
I mean, the thing you mentioned about politicians, and Nick Gibbs being a long-standing one, in the main, their view has to be a short-term one. So they have to measure something that's measurable within a short term. And that's where Ofsted comes in. And I, like all of you, will have met pupils over the years who are now probably middle-aged, that you've seen them develop. And education takes time, and it needs time.
Yeah.
And teachers who actually collaborate with their pupils. We come back to that. It needs time. You can't measure it in short-term things.
So
yeah,
as we
that was I can't remember what the Christian Schiller's saying about how education progresses, but it was something to do with the speed of a worm, I think. You know, and yeah, pace again, speed.
It does. I mean, we went through that time where there was an expectation by Ofsted that every child would have made progress within that hour's lesson. And I remember thinking it was total nonsense, because that's not how children work. You know, it's that, you know, in education, it's that wonderful moment, isn't it, when the penny drops, and it can be weeks, weeks of putting in the base work, of trying different things, of putting it this way, trying it that way, and then the penny drops and eureka, and that's the teacher moment. And we're not allowed to have many of those because we have to hurry it.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And as we start to sort of give ourselves a way of sort of bringing this all together, I think the important thing that you mentioned there, of course, is the time, and not having a long-term plan that everyone's able to work towards, except, of course, we do have a profession of people that have been in it for a long time. I think the politics side is very interesting, because and like you say, the perception of the politics, I'm sure the government would turn around and say, look, we've asked the education system what you think related to Ofsted. We've had people go into Downing Street and have conversations about what they'd like to be. I've seen pictures of various people that were brought in for a meeting. So I think their perception probably is that they are listening. The question is that are they listening to enough people in the right kind of way, which again is probably a bigger conversation. So in terms of what we want to get out of our conversation today in terms of moving this forward, of course, we want people to download and to read the report so that they know exactly what that's all about. Is there anything else that we'd like to do, or we'd like to ask people to do, to actually sort of make this conversation something that can go on beyond this evening? And I liked Peter's idea of having a banner outside the school, because I've heard that twice in the last few weeks, because the other one that I heard was from Professor Gare Grouse, and he said not to put an outstanding a banner outside of your school, because what it means is that you're outstanding at complying, as opposed to being an outstanding school. And I'm paraphrasing and taking it my way, but I think that was the gist of what that was. So is there anything that we can do apart from all go out and put a requires improvement banner outside of our school to get this conversation to keep going for the people that really need it? What do you think, Peter?
Oh gosh, Well, we're trying very hard to get traction. We're trying very hard to get meetings with various people at DFE, who are pretty resistant to meeting anybody with different ideas, it seems. We have talked to a couple of former HMIs who are working hard at doing what's called an alternative big consultation, in opposition to Ofsted's big consultation. And they were very interesting, and they're working hard on this. But it's not a new thing, Mark. Things change very, very slowly in education. And I think we would all testify to the ideas that we've held for maybe 30, 40 years, about the way in which we think education should be brought about, and the way in which we've tried to engineer it in our schools. And yet still things haven't changed. You could walk into a school now and it wouldn't be much different to 10 years ago in a primary school. There might be a bit more technology, but not much else has changed. And there have been people pushing for change for a very long time. And I think that we just need to raise our voices and try to encourage people and make links with many others.
Peter, could I just ask you and Alfie just to fill us in, as it were, about what Julie Waters said today on the radio? Because Julie had a view, didn't she?
Yeah, she wrote with others to the DFE, asking them to delay the imposition of any new construction by Ofsted, because what Ofsted are proposing, what they've published so far, is no improvement, and it certainly doesn't support what head teachers. Julie Waters, of course, is Ruth Perry's sister, and she is very active in campaigning to try to get Ofsted to recognise the impact that they have. And yes, that was my recollection of what she said yesterday morning. Alfie, did you hear that?
Yeah. No, she was saying they haven't listened to the coroner's report.
Yeah.
They haven't listened to the pain. It's right. And her sister Ruth, as several of us know, was the most conscientious, dedicated, inspiring person. I worked with her in Reading. And the only problem she had was she worried too much. You've got to get rid of that worry. Ofsted must stop us worrying.
Yeah.
We want to grow.
Education is to be enjoyed by all.
Yeah.
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 And when I think of when I ended up, my first headship was a village school of about 60 children, and I had one child in my class of 30 juniors, who was a top infant, and so I had her for 5 years, and I had other children who didn't mature that much, but I watched them grow, and the head teacher before me had been there 30 odd years, and I said, "How do you know what to teach them?" And she said, "They'll tell you." Right? Just let that dwell. They'll tell you. And she was right. We grow with.
That's a very good note to end on.
It was very, very, very well put. And I think the other big takeaway for me is the idea of that collaboration. And I think that's the one thing we can agree on to actually be able to do. This video is going to live obviously here on YouTube. If you're going to watch it on the replay, thank you very much indeed. Leave a comment, let us know what you think, tell us your experiences of an inspection, and good, bad, indifferent, just so that we can start to like pull all these things together. And obviously everyone at OST can obviously gain more information in that, in terms of how they can speak to people and take this further forward as well. And NAPE, of course, with whatever it can do to have these conversations and to make this a conversation that keeps going across parliaments, across years, and bringing in the experience of everybody. Certainly including the people that have been here today. So Peter, Pip, Lynn, Alfie, thank you so much for your conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you for the work that you're doing. The description and the websites are in the description of this episode, so you can click straight through and get information about that report as well. So any final pieces of wisdom that you'd like to share as you say goodbye? And Peter, I'll give you first refusal.
It's always nice to be asked to give some shred of wisdom before anybody else does, and you don't have time to think. There's not a lot of wisdom left in me, Mark. I've used it all up over the years, I think. But the one thing that I would say is that we have to remember that the reason why we educate, the reason why we want children to learn things, is to make us a better community, to make us a better society. It is to support everybody. And we can always remember that the things that we actually teach in our schools aren't necessarily very important in terms of the subjects, because children in other countries learn different subjects and different content. So losing sight of the fact that it's something beyond the content that we're teaching, and we're helping children to learn, helping them to enjoy learning and want to continue learning.
Fantastic. Pip?
Yeah.
Oh, just very simply, I want an inspection model that is collaborative and developmental.
Love it. And Lynn?
Trust. We need trust back in our schools, and teachers go into teaching to help children develop. And schools, in my opinion, we are there to do what is best for the children in our care, and we need to be trusted to do it.
I love that. And Elfie?
Yeah, I hate the whole business of school. I hate the word school. It reminds me of fish. I like learning establishments, and we've got to let teachers grow with the children, learning establishments.
I love that. Thank you all. Mike, thank you for being with us as well. I really appreciate you spending the time with us. And as we said, if you're watching on the replay, please do let us know. I think if we can encapsulate those last couple of minutes and that roundup, I think we probably have everything that we'd need at the heart of what any school will be. And if we can have an inspection based on that, then we're going to be in really good shape. So thank you to the four of you. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for all of you watching. It's been great to be able to share these insights. As I said, all the details you need are in the description, and we will be back again with a new episode very soon. If there's any particular topic you would like us to cover through NAPE, then let us know. If you go to the website, that'll give you a way of getting in contact, and that will be absolutely wonderful, because we're here to do and have conversations that are important to you so that we can support you. Thank you. Have a great evening, and really appreciate you being here.
Ooh.